Victor Hale didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Clara Whitmore's boarding room swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and the two men behind him had their hands already resting on their guns before she could even rise from her chair. Victor himself walked straight to her table, picked up the folded deed sitting there, and held it between two fingers like it was something that had already belonged to him. "Sign it over," he said, "or I'll have my men burn the whole lot by morning and tell the sheriff you left on your own." Clara stood slowly. She was 58 years old, silver-haired and straight-backed, and she looked at Victor Hale the way a woman looks at something she has seen before and is no longer afraid of. She said nothing. He smiled and dropped the deed on the floor. If this kind of story moves you, the ones about people who refuse to disappear, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. This is the story of Elias Crow and Clara Whitmore, and it begins not with a gunshot, but with a voice. The town of Redemption Ridge sat in a shallow valley between two ridge lines that had no business being that close together, like the land itself had been pressed inward by something old and heavy and still unresolved. The main street was wide enough for two wagons to pass without courtesy, though courtesy was in short supply most days. The buildings were sun-bleached and practical. A general store, a livery, a jailhouse with a door that never fully latched, two saloons, and a handful of other establishments that served purposes the town didn't discuss in polite company. It was not a beautiful place. It was, however, a place where a man could disappear into routine and call it peace, which was as close to peace as Elias Crow had managed in a long time. He had arrived 6 weeks earlier with a single saddlebag, a horse that was not young, and a reputation that arrived 3 days ahead of him the way bad weather often does, carried on the wind by people who had nothing better to move from one town to the next. The name Elias Crow meant something out on the frontier. It meant a man who had survived more gunfights than could be honestly counted and walked away from all of them, not because he was lucky, but because he was faster and colder and considerably more determined than the men across from him. That was the reputation. The reality, at 54 years old, was that Elias's right shoulder ached every morning before he got out of bed. His eyes took longer than they used to adjust from shade to sunlight, and he drank 2 cups of strong black coffee each day. Not because he enjoyed it, but because without it, the mornings felt like moving through wet clay. He had a slight drag in his left boot from a wound that had healed wrong years ago, and when the cold came down from the mountains in the evenings, his knuckles stiffened up bad enough that he had to keep them wrapped. He didn't tell anyone these things. A reputation is only useful if the people around you believe it completely. He took a room above the Silverhorn Saloon and paid 3 weeks in advance, which the proprietor, a heavy-set man named Dobbins with spectacular sideburns and a persistent cough, took as evidence that Elias intended to cause no trouble. He was half right. Elias didn't intend anything anymore. That was the problem. Intention required believing the future would be different from the past, and he had stopped believing that some years back. He settled into routine. Mornings, he took his coffee at the small table near the window of the saloon, which was empty and quiet at that hour, save for Dobbins wiping down the bar and occasionally complaining at no one in particular about the price of lamp oil. Afternoons, Elias walked. He walked the edges of town, the ridge trails, the dry creek beds that ran behind the livery. He wasn't looking for anything. He had given up looking. Walking was just something his legs did now when his mind needed somewhere to go that wasn't the past. The past was enormous. The past took up most of the available space inside him. 25 years is a long time to carry a person around who isn't there anymore. He had not set out to become a gunslinger. That word always made him slightly uncomfortable, like a coat that fit the wrong way across the shoulders. What he had been, in the years before Clara, was a ranch hand and a fair horseman with a quick temper and decent aim. The aim and the temper had served him better than the horsework, and so one followed the other the way things do when a young man has no clear direction and a particular talent happens to pay well. Clara Whitmore had been 23 when he met her. He was 29 and already carrying too much for a man his age. She was the daughter of a homesteader who'd broken 2 acres of hard land east of the Sulphur River and called it a life. Elias had stopped to water his horse at the edge of her father's property, and she had come out of the house with a rifle balanced across her forearms, looking at him with eyes that were neither afraid nor particularly welcoming. "You lost?" she'd asked. "Not especially," he'd said. "Then you're trespassing." "I'll pay for the water." "With what?" He'd thought about it. "Half a day's work. Your fence line's broken down along the south side." She'd looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that sizes a person up, not by how they dress or what they carry, but by something less nameable, something in the way they hold themselves when they don't know they're being watched. "Fine," she said. "Half a day. Don't make me regret it." He fixed the fence and 3 other things she hadn't mentioned, and she fed him supper and didn't speak much during it, and he thought about her the entire ride back to wherever he was going. He came back the next weekend, and the one after that. It took him 4 months to say anything about it plainly, and when he did, she listened without expression and then said, "I already figured that out. I was wondering when you'd get there." They were married the following spring. They had 18 months together on a small ranch that was more ambition than acreage, and they were not easy months. Money was short, and the land was stubborn, and Elias still took work with his gun when ranching didn't cover the expenses. But they were his. The first thing that had felt like his in a life that had mostly happened to him rather than being chosen. Then the raid. He had been 3 days' ride away, hired work that he'd taken reluctantly and shouldn't have. He came back to smoke and silence and the bones of their barn still holding shape against the sky. The house was gutted. Everything that could be taken had been taken. The neighbors, what few there were, said men had come in the night, 6 or 8 of them, nobody got a clear count, and that there had been shooting, and after that nothing. They found no body. He told himself that meant she could still be alive. He spent 2 years on that hope, trailing rumors through 4 territories, following leads that went nowhere, and asking questions in towns where nobody wanted to answer them. Somewhere in the 3rd year, the hope began to sour into something else, something harder and less useful. And by the time he let it go entirely, he had already become the thing that the reputation described. A man who was good at violence and had stopped caring much what he pointed that skill at. He wasn't proud of it. He also wasn't particularly ashamed. Shame requires that you imagine yourself capable of having been otherwise, and Elias had stopped imagining things a long time ago. That was the man who arrived in Redemption Ridge on a gray Tuesday morning in October, with a sore shoulder and a horse named after nothing and no intention of being anywhere in particular. He had been there 6 weeks when it happened. It was a Wednesday. He was sure of that afterward because Dobbins always received his supply delivery on Wednesdays and was always in a foul mood about whatever arrived broken, and when Elias came down the stairs from his room that afternoon, Dobbins was already in conversation with a delivery man about a cracked jug that was apparently a recurring problem and would apparently never be resolved to anyone's satisfaction. Elias moved through the saloon toward his usual table. There were 4 other men in the room, 2 playing cards without much enthusiasm, 1 asleep with his hat over his face, 1 nursing a beer at the far end of the bar. The light through the front window was the late afternoon kind, long and low and slightly orange, and it threw the room into the kind of warm half-shadow that made everything look more peaceful than it actually was. He was 3 steps from his chair when he heard it. Not the words first. The voice. It stopped him the way nothing physical had managed to stop him in years. Not a drawn gun, not a shout, not the sound of violence incoming. It stopped him somewhere deep in the architecture of him, in some chamber he had sealed shut so long ago he'd stopped believing it existed. He stood completely still. Elias. Just his name. 1 word. Quiet, like someone who was not sure the name would get a response and was bracing for the disappointment of silence. He turned. She was standing near the back of the room, 10 feet away, in a plain gray dress with a wool shawl across her shoulders. Her hair, which he remembered as the dark brown of good river mud, had gone mostly silver. Her face had more lines than he remembered, and the lines were earned, written in by weather and time and whatever weight of living had accumulated across 25 years. Her hands, held together in front of her, were the hands of a woman who had worked for a long time at difficult things. Her eyes were the same. Exactly the same. He had known those eyes when he was 29 years old, and every part of him that still remembered being 29 years old recognized them instantly and without argument. He said nothing. He couldn't locate a single word. She said quietly, "Do you remember me?" Something happened in his chest that he had no name for. He had been shot twice in his life, once in the shoulder, once at close range along his left side that should have done considerably more damage than it did. And this felt somewhat similar to that second one, the one that had knocked him backward and taken the air completely out of him. He said, "Clara." Not a question. He knew it wasn't a question. There was no version of that face, aged by 25 years or aged by 50, that he would have failed to recognize. She let out a long, slow breath like someone who had been holding it for some time. "I wasn't sure you'd—" She stopped, started again. "I heard you were in town. I heard your name 3 days ago and I told myself I was wrong, that it was another Elias Crow, that there are probably a lot of men by that name." "There aren't," he said. "No," she said. "No, I suppose not." They stood there looking at each other with the width of a saloon between them and 25 years above them like weather, and Elias became aware that his hands had dropped to his sides without him telling them to, and that the card players had gone quiet, and that even Dobbins had stopped arguing about the jug. "Can we—" He had to try the sentence twice. "Can we go somewhere else?" It wasn't a question either. They sat in the small side room that Dobbins used for storage, surrounded by barrels and crates, and the smell of sawdust and dried grain, and they faced each other across a table that was too small for how large the silence between them was. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She'd stopped twisting them together, which told him she was working to stay steady. "You survived," he said. "I did." "After the raid?" "Yes." He had to put both palms flat on the table himself because they were not steady. "I looked for you. Clara, I looked for 2 years. I found nothing. No one could—" He stopped. His voice had developed an unsteadiness he didn't care for. "I thought you were dead." She nodded, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but acknowledged. Like she had known this part was coming and had been preparing herself for it. "I know. I found that out much later. By the time I understood what had happened to you, where you'd gone, what you'd become, there was no way to reach you." She looked at him steadily. "And by then, I wasn't entirely sure reaching you would be wise." That landed with some weight. He didn't argue it. He'd been, for large stretches of those years, precisely the kind of man one does not send a letter to. "Where did you go?" he asked. "After." She was quiet for a moment. "Into the hills first. I hid for 4 days. I was terrified to come back. When I finally did—" She stopped, and something moved across her face that she didn't fully allow to surface. The ranch was gone. The house. The animals. The equipment. All of it. And you weren't there. No sign that you'd been back. No note. Nothing. Her jaw tightened. "I went to the nearest town, asked around. Nobody knew anything about you. Some people thought you were dead too. One man told me he'd heard you'd left the territory entirely." "I had," Elias said. "I was trying to find—" He stopped. "I was trying to find you. I know that now." "But you didn't then." "No," she said. "I didn't then." She looked at her hands. "What I knew then was that I was alone. I had no money, no property, and no one who was particularly interested in helping an older woman with no attachments get back on her feet." "You were 33, Elias said. He heard how that sounded the moment he said it, defensive, like an argument against an accusation she hadn't made. Clara gave him a look that carried an entire paragraph in it. "Out here," she said evenly. 33 alone was considered well past the age when a woman's situation improves. He had no answer for that because it was true, and they both knew it. "I'm sorry," he said. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate. She didn't contradict him, which he took not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement that there are some situations where adequacy isn't on offer, and you say what you can. "What did you do?" he asked. "All of it. Where did you go?" She was quiet for a moment, like she was deciding not how much to tell him, but where to start. "East, first. I knew a woman in a town called Belmore who took in boarders. She gave me a room for work, cleaning, cooking, mending. She said this without complaint, as simple fact. After a year, I moved on. I worked as a seamstress in 2 different towns. I picked up some medicine work from a frontier doctor named Halstead, who was too old to do it himself and needed someone with patient hands. A slight pause. I was good at it. I don't doubt that. I managed a failing ranch outside of Carbide Springs for 3 years, turned it around well enough that the owner sold it at a profit, and gave me a fair wage for my trouble. She said this without pride, just accuracy. Then I came here. Why here? She looked at him directly. Because I heard the land disputes along this valley were getting bad, and I knew I had some knowledge that might be useful to people who were being cheated. She paused. And because I was tired of moving. I've been here 8 months. I have a room at the Weston boarding house, and I do medical work, and I help 3 neighboring ranches manage their books and their disputes. She looked at him steadily. I was building something. Was. The past tense landed between them. That changes when I showed up, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Something tightened around her eyes. I don't know yet. Victor Hale has been watching this valley for 2 years. My land... She stopped. A piece of property I've been purchasing through an arrangement with the county recorder. Hale wants it. He's been trying various methods to obtain it. She said various methods the way you say something when the real meaning is considerably more specific and considerably more unpleasant. He's a man who believes that the right amount of pressure applied correctly will move anyone. Has he been threatening you? It wasn't phrased as a question, but she answered it anyway. He sent men to my room 2 nights ago. They knocked politely at first. A beat. And then not politely. Elias went very still. Clara, I'm not telling you so you'll go find them, she said sharply, and the sharpness was so familiar. That particular edge she got when she'd anticipated an argument and was heading it off at the source, that it knocked him briefly sideways. I'm telling you because you need to understand the situation if you're going to be in this town. What did you tell them? I told them to leave, and when they didn't, I picked up the lamp from my table and made very clear that I was comfortable with outcomes that were bad for everyone in the room. Elias looked at her. Did they leave? They did. He let out a breath. He wasn't sure if it was relief or something else, something closer to pride, which was a strange thing to feel about a woman he'd been married to for 18 months and lost for 25 years, and was only now looking at again from 3 feet away. You're not afraid of him, he said. I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid, she corrected him. I'm afraid of what he's capable of. I'm not afraid of him personally, which is a distinction that matters. She looked at him. Are you? Am I afraid of Victor Hale? Are you afraid of anything? He thought about that with more honesty than he usually gave to such questions. Plenty of things, he said. I'm afraid of this. He gestured between them, vaguely, meaning the whole of it. I'm afraid of... I spent 25 years telling myself you were gone. That's a long time to spend telling yourself something. You get accustomed to it. And now you're sitting across from me, and I... He stopped. His voice had done the unsteady thing again. He let it. Clara watched him. She didn't fill the silence, and she didn't look away. I don't know what to do with you being alive, he said finally. I mean that honestly. I don't know what it means, or what it changes, or what... I just... He stopped again. You look the same. I look 25 years older, she said, flat. Yes, he said. That's what I mean. That surprised her. He could see it, a small fracture in the steadiness she was maintaining, something that moved behind her eyes for just a moment before she pulled it back. I'm not the same person, she said carefully. I know. I've changed considerably. I'm not the woman you knew. I know that too. Elias. She looked at him directly. I need you to understand that whatever this is, whatever is happening right now, I'm not looking for a rescuer. I've spent 25 years learning how to not need one. I'm not going to unlearn that because you walked back into a saloon and I recognized your voice through a wall. I don't want to rescue you. You have a very specific look on your face that suggests otherwise. He paused. He probably did. Old habit. Break it. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the late afternoon was moving into evening. He could hear the general noise of Redemption Ridge settling into its nightly rhythms. Horses, voices, the distant off-key contribution of someone attempting music in the other saloon. "All right," he said. "All right what?" "All right," he said again, more slowly, like he was working something out as he said it. "I'll break it." He met her eyes. "But I'm not going anywhere." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands. She didn't argue. He took that as the closest thing to an agreement that 25 years of separation and 15 minutes of conversation was going to produce, and he decided it was enough to work with. Outside, the sun dropped behind the western ridge. Inside the small storage room that smelled of sawdust and old grain, two people who had spent a quarter of a century learning how to live without each other sat in silence and tried to figure out what came next. Neither of them had any idea. That, Elias supposed, was at least somewhere to begin. He didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual for Elias. Sleep had been an unreliable thing for years, something that came in short installments and left without notice. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. It wasn't the familiar empty kind, the kind that was just silence with his eyes open. This one had weight and direction. It kept pulling him back to the storage room, to the table, to her hands flat against the wood and her voice saying things he was still working through. He lay on his back in the room above the silver horn and stared at the ceiling and did the thing he was worst at, which was sitting still with something he couldn't resolve through action. Clara was alive. He had said it to himself probably 40 times since she walked out of that storage room and back into whatever her evening looked like, and it still didn't fully land. 25 years of certainty has a particular grip on a person. You don't let it go in one night just because the evidence has changed. He thought about what she'd said. The lamp, the two men, Victor Hale. He thought about it with a cold, careful attention that he recognized as the part of him that was useful in dangerous situations and considerably less useful everywhere else. The part that cataloged threats and calculated responses and didn't waste a lot of time on feelings about either. The feelings were happening in a different part of him entirely, and they were loud, and he was doing his best to ignore them until he had more information. He got up before dawn, dressed, and went downstairs. Dobbins wasn't up yet. Elias made the coffee himself, which he'd done before on mornings when he woke before the establishment's hospitality was operational, and he sat at his table and watched the dark outside the window turn gradually to gray. She had said she was building something. Was. Past tense. He'd caught it. She had caught him catching it. He drank his coffee and thought about Victor Hale. And by the time the sky was properly light, he had already made one decision, which was that before he did anything else, he was going to find out exactly who Victor Hale was and what he was actually doing in this valley. Not from gossip, not from saloon talk, from someone who knew. The man he needed was a county records clerk named Perch. At least that was what people called him. Elias had never gotten a first name, who operated out of a small office attached to the back of the jailhouse, and who was understood to be the closest thing Redemption Ridge had to an institutional memory. Perch had been keeping county records for 11 years, which meant he had seen the paperwork behind every land transaction, every dispute, every boundary complaint that had moved through this valley in over a decade. Elias found him at 8 in the morning, sitting behind a desk, so buried in paper that only his head and shoulders were visible above it. Perch was a thin man in his mid-40s with ink permanently stained into the creases of his right hand, and the careful, slightly suspicious expression of someone who has learned that people who come asking questions about land records rarely have simple reasons for asking. "Crow," Perch said without looking particularly surprised. "I figured you'd come in eventually. Sit down." Elias sat. Victor Hale. "I know why you're here," Perch said. He leaned back in his chair and folded his ink-stained hands across his stomach. "And I'll tell you what I can tell you, which is a matter of public record, and you can draw your own conclusions from there. That's all I'm asking." Perch looked at him for a moment like he was deciding whether that was actually true. "Hale's been buying land in this valley for 2 years. Started on the north side, worked his way south. He's acquired 12 parcels that I know of, some through fair purchase, some through..." He paused. Arrangements that looked fair on paper but had circumstances attached that made them less than voluntary in practice. What kind of circumstances? The kind that involve water, Perch said. Hale controls the primary irrigation access on the north side of the valley. When a rancher found their water cut off last spring, they held out for about 6 weeks before they signed over. When a family on the East Ridge had their fence line challenged through a surveying dispute that turned out to have some significant irregularities in the paperwork, he stopped. You understand what I'm telling you. He manufactures leverage, Elias said. He applies pressure in ways that are difficult to trace directly back to him. Perch looked at his hands. The property you're probably interested in, the parcel on the southern end near Copper Creek, that's been under a purchase arrangement with the county for about 8 months. A woman named Whitmore has been making payments. I know who she is. Then you know Hale's been trying to challenge the legitimacy of the arrangement for the last 3 months. He's got a lawyer in Dermont filing claims that the original surveying was inaccurate, that the parcel boundaries overlap with a prior claim he says his family held 20 years ago. Perch's expression was carefully neutral. The claim is thin. It might also be sufficient depending on how the territorial judge looks at it. How does the territorial judge usually look at things that Victor Hale brings to him? The silence that followed was itself an answer. Thank you, Elias said. I haven't told you anything that isn't public record, Perch said, which was the kind of statement a careful man makes when he's told you considerably more than that. He went from Perch's office directly to the Weston boarding house, which was 3 blocks off the main street in a building that had been painted white at some point in the past, and was now approaching a color that could charitably be described as cream. A woman named Mrs. Weston, heavy-set, efficient, with the expression of someone who had heard every possible excuse and was not interested in new ones, answered the door and looked at him with the particular assessment that landladies apply to men who appear at their door before 9 in the morning asking for female residents. She's expecting you, Mrs. Weston said, which surprised him. Is she? She said a large man with a gun would probably come by early. She said to let you in. A pause. I don't usually let men into my residence rooms. I appreciate the exception. Don't make me regret it. Clara's room was on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall. The door was open. She was sitting at a small desk near the window with papers spread in front of her, and she was wearing a different dress than yesterday, darker, more worn, and her hair was pinned up in the practical way she had always done it when she was working, not when she was going somewhere. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. I thought you'd go find out about Hale first. I did. Perch? Yes. Sit down, then. I'll tell you the rest. She gestured at a chair near the wall, the only other piece of furniture in the room that wasn't a bed or a washstand. The room was small and orderly, with a precision to its arrangement that spoke of someone who had lived in other people's spaces long enough to know how to make the most of limited territory. There was a small stack of books on the floor beside the desk, a medical bag under the bed, and, he noticed this without meaning to, a rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach of where she sat. He moved the chair and sat in it and did not comment on the rifle. How much did Perch tell you? She asked. The water? The surveying claim? The judge? She nodded. Then you know the shape of it. What Perch probably doesn't know, she shuffled through the papers on her desk and produced a folded document, is that I've spent the last 3 months pulling together every piece of documentation I can find on Hale's land acquisitions going back 12 years, not just here, before he came to this valley. She held the papers out to him. He took them and looked, though land documents were not exactly his area. What he could see was that there were a great many of them, and that someone had gone through them with systematic attention. Notations in the margins, dates underlined, connections drawn between parcels. 12 years ago, Clara said, her voice taking on the focused quality of someone who has had this thought many times and organized it well, Victor Hale was operating a similar scheme in the Creston Valley, 2 territories east. He acquired 14 parcels over 3 years through a combination of legitimate purchase and manufactured disputes. Then he sold the consolidated land to a mining company for 8 times what he paid. She leaned forward slightly. The same lawyer that filed the surveying claim here, a man named Aldrich out of Dermont, filed 3 of the challenges in Creston. Elias looked up from the papers. You've been researching him for months. 8 months, she said, since before he started coming after my property. I saw the pattern developing and I wanted to understand it before it arrived at my door. How did you get all of this? Letters, she said. I wrote to county records offices in 3 territories. Most of them wrote back. A slight pause. People respond to a woman who writes a careful, specific letter and explains what she's looking for. They respond less well to a man who shows up and demands things. She looked at him. In my experience, he set the papers down on his knee. What are you planning to do with this? Present it, she said. There's a circuit judge due in this valley in 5 weeks. Not the one Hale has an arrangement with, a different one. A woman named Hargrove who rides the Northern Circuit and has a reputation for being deeply unimpressed by paperwork that doesn't hold together. She looked at him steadily. If I can get this documentation in front of her before Hale's lawyer files the next claim, I can challenge the entire basis of his acquisition strategy. Not just the claim against my land, all of it. Elias was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was moving furniture in the room above them, dragging something heavy across the floor in a way that required 2 attempts. He's going to come at you harder, Elias said, when he figures out what you're doing. I know. Those men who came to your room, they're going to come back. I know that too. Clara, he leaned forward, I'm not going to argue with your plan. It's a good plan, but there's a gap between now and 5 weeks from now. And Hale is not a man who waits patiently. She met his eyes. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. You need someone watching your back while you build your case, and I happen to be available. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her turning this over, looking for the part that cost her something she wasn't willing to spend. You mean you want to be involved? I am involved. That happened yesterday in the saloon, and it's not something either of us can undo. Elias, not as a rescuer, he said, and he held her gaze. You were clear on that, and I heard you. I mean as someone who has a particular set of skills that are relevant to a situation where a dangerous man is sending armed men to your room. He paused. And as someone who, it turns out, is still very much interested in what happens to you. That last part came out less controlled than he intended. He saw her register it. A slight shift. Something careful and complicated moving in her expression. She looked down at her papers. I don't need you to... I know you don't need me to, he said. I'm not here because you need me. I'm here because I want to be here. There's a difference. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, you can't go after his men. Not unless they come at you first. Elias, not unless they come at you first, he repeated steadily. That's the line. I'll hold it. She studied him. He had the distinct impression of being assessed by someone who had developed, over a long time and through difficult experience, an extremely accurate sense of when people were telling the truth and when they were telling a version of the truth that was convenient for them. All right, she said finally. All right. But you listen to me when I tell you to stand down. If I say we let something go and handle it through the legal route, I'll listen. You're not good at listening. I've been working on it. She gave him a look that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one. For 25 years? Longer than that, honestly, he said. I was never especially good at it. She shook her head, and something loosened slightly in the room. Not quite ease, not yet, but the faintest suggestion that ease was somewhere in the direction they were headed. She turned back to her papers. There's something else I need to tell you about that night. He went still. The raid, she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the papers, though he didn't think she was reading them. I've told you the outline of it. I hid in the hills. I came back and you were gone. What I haven't told you is what I found when I came back. Tell me. She folded her hands on the desk. Our closest neighbor at the time was a man named Gideon Ford. He had a property about 2 miles east of ours. Older man, widower, generally kept to himself, but decent enough. She paused. When I came back from hiding, I went to Ford's property first. His place was untouched. The men who raided us didn't go near him. Elias said nothing, but something tightened in his chest. I thought that was strange, Clara said, and I asked him about it. He told me he'd been away, that he hadn't heard anything. She looked up. but there were fresh boot prints around his barn, and his horse had been ridden hard recently. You could tell by the sweat marks. She met Elias's eyes. I was 33 years old and frightened and had nothing, and I didn't know what to do with what I was looking at, so I didn't do anything with it. I left, and I kept going. The silence in the room had a different quality now. You think Ford was involved, Elias said. I think Ford knew who those men were, Clara said. I think he may have told them when you'd be away from the property. I don't know if he arranged it or if he was just a man with loose enough principles that he answered questions when the wrong people asked them. Her voice was level and controlled, but her hands had tightened against each other on the desk. I've thought about it for 25 years. I don't know if I'll ever know for certain. Is Ford still alive? I have no idea, she said, and it doesn't matter. I'm not telling you this so you can go find him. I'm telling you because I realized last night that I've been carrying this for a very long time without telling anyone, and that seemed... She stopped, started again. I realized I should tell you because it concerns you, because it was your life too. He looked at her. He could feel the anger that the information produced, clean and cold and looking for somewhere to go, and he let it sit without directing it anywhere because she had asked him not to and because she was right. It was old. Whatever Ford had done or not done, it was 25 years buried, and digging it up wouldn't give either of them back what they'd lost. Thank you, he said, for telling me. She nodded. She looked tired suddenly, not physically, but in the way of someone who has put down something heavy and is feeling all at once the strain of having carried it. Clara, he said, can I ask you something? You can ask? Were there... He wasn't sure how to phrase this. Was there anyone? In all that time, was there... No, she said. She said it without hesitation, but also without the edge she might have used if she felt the question was inappropriate. Just plainly, like the answer to a question with a plain answer. There were men who were interested. I wasn't interested back. She looked at him with a steadiness that cost her something. I kept moving. It's difficult to build that kind of thing when you keep moving. He nodded. He didn't ask why she kept moving because he thought he understood it and didn't want to be wrong out loud. You? She asked. No, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then, you don't have to say that. I'm not saying it to make you feel something. I'm saying it because it's true. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was longer than it sounds when the thing you're deciding whether to believe is that particular. All right, she said. I believe you. He let out a breath he hadn't been aware of holding. She stood up and went to the window. The morning light was full now, coming in from the east and catching the silver in her hair in a way that he was trying very hard not to think too much about. I need to go out this morning. There's a rancher on the South Road, name of Tatum, who's been having a boundary dispute with a neighbor that's been getting increasingly unpleasant. I promised I'd come by and look at his paperwork. I'll walk with you, Elias said. She turned from the window. I walk alone generally. I know. He held her gaze. I'll walk with you. She considered him. He could see her weighing the argument against the practical reality, and he could see the practical reality winning by a narrow margin, which was probably the best he was going to get. You don't talk the whole way, she said. I think when I walk. I'm not much of a talker. You've talked more in the last 12 hours than I remember you talking in 18 months of marriage. He paused. I have more to say now. Something moved across her face, that same small fracture in her composure, the same thing that had happened in the storage room the night before when he'd said she looked the same. Like he'd said something that touched a place she wasn't entirely defended against. She turned back and began gathering papers from her desk. Come on then, she said. Don't fall behind. He stood. He put the land records papers back on her desk in roughly the order they'd been in. He followed her to the door. On the way down the stairs, with Mrs. Weston watching from the bottom landing with the same evaluative expression she'd worn all morning, Elias thought about what it meant that Clara had already laid out the problem and the strategy and the timeline with the kind of precision that took not just intelligence, but the specific kind of intelligence that comes from having survived long enough in difficult circumstances to know that the difference between problems you can solve and problems that solve you is almost always preparation. She hadn't been waiting for him. She hadn't needed him to show up. She had been in the process of winning this on her own terms before he walked into that saloon. He understood, walking behind her through the door and into the morning, that the thing he had spent 25 years telling himself, that he had failed her, that he had not been there when it mattered, that his absence had left her defenseless in a world that treated alone women with casual cruelty, was both true and incomplete. She had not been left defenseless. She had built defenses he'd never taught her and never could have, out of materials he wouldn't have thought to look for. He had not saved her, she had saved herself. And the thing that landed somewhere in the center of his chest as he walked out into the October morning behind the woman he had spent 25 years grieving was not relief exactly, and it wasn't quite pride, and it wasn't the thing he might have expected to feel upon discovering that she hadn't needed him at all. It was something closer to, and this took him a while to name it, walking quietly behind her down the frost-edged street while she moved with the straight-backed, purposeful stride of someone who knew where she was going, something closer to being glad. Not that she had suffered less than he'd feared. She had suffered plenty. He could see it in the lines of her and hear it in the careful way she talked around the edges of certain memories. But glad that whatever the world had thrown at her, she had remained entirely, recognizably, defiantly herself. Somewhere on the South Road, Redemption Ridge behind them, and Tatum's fence line appearing in the middle distance, Clara said without turning around, "You're thinking very loudly." "Sorry," he said. "Don't be. Just—" She stopped walking and turned to face him. Her expression was impossible to fully read, but he could see in it the same mix of things he felt in himself. Old grief, old loss, and something newer and more precarious underneath it. "This is strange," she said. "All of this. I need you to know that I'm aware of how strange this is. I know it's strange." "I don't know what I want from you," she said. And the honesty of it, the plain, undefended quality of it, was so characteristic of the woman he'd known that it almost flattened him. "I haven't figured that out yet. I'm not going to pretend I have." "That's all right," he said. "I haven't figured it out either." She studied him. The morning light was in her eyes. "Don't rush me," she said. "I won't." "And don't—" She hesitated. "Don't be someone you're not. I knew who you were. I can probably work with who you've become, but don't perform something better for my benefit. I'll see through it, and I'll like you less for trying." "Understood," he said. She turned and kept walking. He walked beside her this time, rather than behind. She didn't say anything about it. That, he decided, was enough for one morning. The visit to Tatum's ranch took most of the morning. Tatum himself was a compact, weathered man in his 60s who shook Clara's hand before he shook Elias's, which told Elias something about the nature of their existing relationship. His boundary dispute turned out to be more complicated than a simple line disagreement. A neighboring property had changed hands twice in the last year, and each new owner had brought with them a slightly different interpretation of where the eastern fence ought to sit, and the cumulative drift had cost Tatum approximately 40 yards of grazing land that he could not afford to lose. Clara sat at his kitchen table for an hour with the relevant documents spread between them and walked him through what he had, what he was missing, and what he needed to request from the county office before the dispute could be formally filed. She did it with a patience and precision that Elias, sitting in the corner with his coffee going cold, found quietly remarkable. Not because he was surprised she was capable of it, he had always known she was the more methodical of the two of them, but because of how naturally it had become her. This was not something she was performing. This was simply what she did now. Tatum's wife, a thin woman named Edith who had said almost nothing during the entire meeting, walked them to the door when they left and caught Clara's arm briefly. "You be careful," Edith said. "Hale's men were at the Greer property 2 days ago, didn't do anything, just stood at the fence line and watched." She glanced at Elias, then back at Clara. "The watching's the part that scares me." Clara thanked her, and they walked back toward town in the thin autumn sunlight, and Elias turned Edith's words over in his head the whole way. "The watching's the part that scares me." That was a specific kind of intimidation, not the blunt instrument of direct threat, but the slow, patient kind that said, "I am always aware of where you are and what you're doing." It was the kind of pressure that wore people down over weeks rather than breaking them in a single confrontation. "He's mapping the valley," Elias said. Clara didn't look at him. "I know. He knows who's connected to you. He's trying to figure out who'd break first and take you with them." "I know that too." She walked steadily, her pace unchanged. "What he doesn't know is that I've already spoken to every ranch in this valley that he's put pressure on. I've been doing it quietly for 4 months. Elias looked at her. "How many?" 7 families, she said. 6 of them are willing to provide statements about what Hale's men have said or done to them. 3 of them have documentation, letters, notes left on property. One rancher kept a written record of every interaction because his wife told him to, and his wife was considerably smarter than he gave her credit for. A slight pause. "Those 3 families alone are enough to establish a pattern. With my Creston Valley documents on top of it, Judge Hargrove will have enough to open a formal inquiry." "And the 7th family?" "The Farleys," she said, and something shifted slightly in her tone. "Martin Farley signed over his north parcel 2 months ago. He says it was voluntary." She was quiet for a moment. "His wife told me privately that they'd received a letter describing in detail what would happen to their barn, their livestock, and their children's schooling arrangements if Martin didn't cooperate." She paused. "Farley's ashamed of it. He thinks cooperation makes him a coward." "Does it?" "It makes him a man who is frightened for his family," Clara said flatly. "That's not the same thing. But he won't testify. I've accepted that." Elias walked alongside her without speaking for a minute. A hawk was working the thermals above the eastern ridge, patient and unhurried. "You've built a case," he said. "I've been building a case," she corrected. "There's a difference. What I have right now is the structure of one. I still need 2 more affidavits from ranchers on the north side who've been reluctant, and I need Perch to certify copies of the original survey records before Hale's lawyer has a chance to file an amendment that muddies the timeline. When does Hargrove arrive?" "I have 5 weeks from yesterday." "Then we have time." She gave him a look that was not unkind but was extremely realistic. "We have enough time if nothing goes wrong," she said. "Things generally go wrong." She was right about that. 3 days later, something went wrong. It arrived in the form of a man named Decker, who came to the Silver Horn Saloon on a Saturday evening and asked Dobbins which table belonged to Elias Crow, and then walked across the room and sat down across from him without being invited. Decker was somewhere in his 30s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that isn't calm but is its imitation. The stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself quiet because movement costs him the element of unpredictability. He put both hands on the table, palms down. A deliberate gesture. "Look, no weapons." Though Elias noted that the gun on his hip was tied down low, which was not a casual man's choice. "Mr. Crow," Decker said, "my employer would like to meet with you." "Your employer has a name," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "Victor Hale," Decker said. "He believes you and he may have interests in common." "Does he?" "He's prepared to be generous with a man of your reputation." Decker said this with the careful neutrality of someone who is reading from a script and knows better than to editorialize. "He suggests tomorrow morning at the Ridge Hotel, 9 o'clock. Elias looked at Decker for a long moment. Decker looked back. Neither of them blinked dramatically because this wasn't that kind of conversation. It was a business delivery, and both of them understood what it was. "Tell your employer I'll think about it," Elias said. Decker nodded, stood, and left. He didn't look back. Dobbins materialized at Elias's elbow approximately 4 seconds later. "That was one of Hale's men," Dobbins said, in the tone of a man delivering information that he suspects is unnecessary, but feels compelled to deliver anyway. "I know," Elias said. "You going to go?" Elias picked up his glass. "Probably." He told Clara the next morning. She was not pleased, but she was also not surprised, which he was beginning to understand was her default state regarding unpleasant developments. "He wants to buy you," she said. She was standing at her desk rather than sitting at it, which he had come to read as a sign that she was working something through. "Or hire you, or both. He'll make it sound like a straightforward business proposition." "I know what it is," Elias said. "Don't go alone." He looked at her. "Clara, I'm not saying take backup. I'm saying take someone who can watch the door and the street and who isn't you, so that if Hale decides the meeting is more useful to him as a demonstration than a negotiation, There's a witness who can report what happened. She met his eyes. There's a difference between walking into a room and walking into a room smartly. He went to the Ridge Hotel at 9 o'clock with a retired deputy named Calloway, whom he'd identified in his first week in Redemption Ridge as the kind of man who stayed sober, kept his mouth shut, and could be trusted to remember accurately what he witnessed. Calloway took a chair in the hotel lobby with a newspaper and a clear sightline to both the front door and the stairs. Victor Hale was waiting in a private room off the main corridor. He was younger than Elias had expected, mid-40s, carefully dressed, with the groomed, prosperous look of a man who had learned that appearance is a form of argument. He stood when Elias entered and extended his hand. Elias shook it, which told him nothing except that Hale's grip was practiced. "Mr. Crow," Hale said, "thank you for coming. Sit down, please." The room had 2 chairs and a small table with a coffee service on it that no one was going to use. Elias sat. Hale sat across from him and crossed one leg over the other in a relaxed posture that he had almost certainly rehearsed. "I'll be direct," Hale said. "I respect your time." "Go ahead," Elias said. "You've been seen in the company of a woman named Whitmore. I understand there may be a prior connection between the two of you." He said this carefully, without emphasis, the way a man mentions something he wants you to know he knows. "Mrs. Whitmore is a capable woman. I have nothing against her personally." A pause that was precisely as long as he'd decided it should be. "But she's involved herself in matters that are complicated, and her involvement is making them more complicated still." "What kind of matters?" "Land consolidation in this valley," Hale said pleasantly. "I have significant investment here. I intend to develop the valley's water resources in a way that will benefit the entire region. Mrs. Whitmore's property sits across a natural drainage corridor that is essential to that plan." He tilted his head slightly. "I've made her fair offers. She's declined them." "It's her property," Elias said. "It is currently," Hale said, "though the legitimacy of her acquisition arrangement is under legal review." He said this the same way he'd said everything else, pleasantly, as though they were discussing the weather. "That review may take some time to resolve. During that time, I'd like things in this valley to remain calm." His eyes moved to Elias with the focused quality of a man getting to his point. "A man with your reputation has significant influence over whether situations remain calm or become otherwise. I'm prepared to offer you a substantial monthly retainer to simply be present, to be available, to be a stabilizing force." "You want me to work for you," Elias said. "I want to ensure your skills are not being directed against my interests," Hale said, which was the same thing said more carefully. Elias was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the hotel, a door closed heavily and then someone laughed about it. "What's the number?" Elias said. Hale named it. It was a large number. It was deliberately large. The kind of offer designed not just to buy someone, but to make refusing it feel foolish. Elias nodded slowly, as if considering. "And if I said yes, what would you want in return, specifically?" "Specifically?" Hale unfolded his hands. "I'd want you to encourage Mrs. Whitmore to accept a fair settlement on the property and move on. I'd want you to communicate to any ranchers in this valley who may be considering legal action that such action is not in their interest. And I'd want you to be available if situations require a physical resolution." The pleasant quality in his voice had thinned slightly, like paint over old wood. "You understand what I mean by that." "I understand what you mean," Elias said. He stood up. Hale looked up at him, and for the first time his composure developed a slight question in it. "Mr. Crow." "I appreciate the directness," Elias said. "I'll be direct back. I've done work I'm not proud of for money I needed, and reasons I told myself were sufficient. I'm done with that kind of work." He held Hale's gaze. "And I'd like you to stop sending men to Clara Whitmore's room." The pleasant quality in Hale's expression left entirely. What replaced it was not anger exactly. It was something colder and more considered, the face of a man doing a rapid recalculation. "I see," he said. "I think you do," Elias said. He turned and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The woman you've been treating as a problem you can pressure into compliance has been building a legal case against your entire acquisition strategy for 8 months. I'd suggest you talk to your lawyer about that before you send anyone else to her door." He left before Hale could respond. Calloway was already on his feet in the lobby when Elias came through, folding the newspaper with the expression of a man who has read the same paragraph 4 times and absorbed none of it. "How'd it go?" "He made me an offer," Elias said. "You take it?" "No." Calloway absorbed this. "He going to be trouble?" "He was already going to be trouble," Elias said. "I just made it more immediate." He went directly to Clara's boarding house. She read his face when she opened the door and stepped back to let him in without making him knock twice. He told her everything: the offer, the amount, what Hale had asked for in return, and what Elias had said on his way out. When he finished, she sat down on the edge of her bed and looked at the floor for a moment, thinking. "You told him about the case," she said. "Not accusatory, processing. I told him enough that he knows you're not without resources. I wanted him to understand that coming after you harder isn't going to make his problem smaller." Elias leaned against the wall. "I may have miscalculated." "You didn't miscalculate," she said, "but you accelerated the timeline." She looked up at him. "He's going to move faster now. Whatever he was planning to do next, he'll do it sooner." "I know. I needed more time." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry." She held his gaze, and he could see her deciding whether to say what she wanted to say and choosing not to, which was its own kind of discipline. "All right," she said. "We adjust." She stood and went to her desk. "I'm going to write to the Northside ranchers tonight, Brecken and Moss, and tell them I need their statements by end of week. No more waiting for them to feel comfortable." She pulled out paper and uncapped her ink. "And I need you to go back to Perch first thing tomorrow and tell him I need those survey certifications by Wednesday. Tell him why." "He'll help," Elias said. "He'll help if he knows the urgency is real," she said. "Make sure he understands it's real." Elias nodded. He watched her begin to write, quick, deliberate strokes, the pen moving without hesitation, and felt the particular mix of helplessness and respect that had been following him around for days, the sense of being slightly behind a situation that she was always 3 steps ahead of. He also felt something else, which was worry. The clean, uncomplicated kind that doesn't need thinking about because it arrives already fully formed. 2 days later, the situation accelerated in the way Clara had predicted and in a direction neither of them had anticipated. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. Elias was at the livery looking at his horse's left shoe, which had developed a loose nail that the animal was too dignified to complain about, but that was going to cause problems if it went unaddressed. The livery owner, a man named Stubbs, was working a different stall and maintaining the kind of low-key running commentary about nothing in particular that seemed to be his conversational baseline. A boy appeared at the livery door, 12 years old, maybe 13, breathing hard from running. He looked around until he found Elias. "You Crow?" the boy said. "Yes," Elias said. "Woman at the boarding house sent me. Said come now, said come fast." He was moving before the boy finished the second sentence. He found Clara in the street in front of the Weston boarding house, not inside, standing on the boardwalk with her arms crossed and her spine very straight. Beside her stood Mrs. Weston, with an expression that suggested she was actively working to control her response to something recent and upsetting. 3 other women were nearby. Boarding house residents, he thought, clustered at a slight distance in the way people cluster when they're witnesses to something they haven't processed yet. 20 feet away, a man was walking toward the far end of the street at a pace that could be described as unhurried. "He broke her window," Mrs. Weston said when Elias reached them. Her voice was tight. "Walked up, threw a rock through the upstairs window, left a note on the door, and walked off calm as you please." Elias looked at Clara. "Are you hurt?" "I wasn't in the room," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, he thought, but anger that was working hard to stay functional. "I was down here. He knew I wasn't in the room." He looked at the note that Mrs. Weston was holding. Clara took it from Mrs. Weston before he could and read it, and then handed it to him. It said, "Accept the offer on the table. The next window will have you behind it." Elias folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the man who was still walking at that unhurried pace down the far end of the street, not looking back, performing the confidence of a person who has done what he came to do and has no concerns about consequences. Elias, Clara said. He was already calculating. Elias. Her hand on his arm, not grabbing, not restraining, just present. Look at me. He looked at her. Not like that, she said. I know what you're thinking. I need you to hear me. If you go after him in the street, Hale has a reason to go to whatever version of law he has in this town and paint you as the aggressor. That note is evidence of what he did. Your going after that man removes its value. Her grip on his arm tightened slightly. I need that note. I need it more than I need you to do what you want to do right now. He breathed. I know, he said. It came out rougher than he intended. I know you know, she said. I need you to act like you know. He exhaled, long and slow. The man at the end of the street turned a corner and was gone. All right, Elias said. All right, she said. Mrs. Weston had been watching this exchange with the expression of a woman reassessing a situation she thought she had understood. I want him out of this town, she said, meaning Hale. I've been operating in this town for 11 years. I'm not going to have women in my house threatened. You won't have to much longer, Clara said. She said it quietly, but with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than optimism. She looked at Elias. Help me board up the window, then I need to write 2 more letters. He helped her board up the window. It was not skilled carpentry. He had not done much carpentry of any kind, and the boards were uneven and the result was functional rather than elegant. But it held, and Clara looked at it when they were done and said, Good enough, which he had the feeling was what she said about most things she'd improvised her way through. That evening, sitting at her small desk in the lamplight while the boarded window made the room feel both more closed in and more defensible, she wrote to Brecken and Moss. She wrote a 3rd letter to a woman in the Creston Valley named Hannah Dole, whom she'd corresponded with before and who had first-hand knowledge of Hale's operations there. And she wrote a 4th letter to Judge Hargrove's circuit clerk, formally requesting an expedited hearing date given recent developments, with the broken window, the note, and Mrs. Weston's account as exhibits. Elias sat in the corner chair and watched her write and felt, alongside the worry and the residual anger that had nowhere productive to go, something that he was going to have to eventually find a word for. It wasn't admiration exactly, though that was part of it. It wasn't the old protective instinct, though that was still present like a reflex he couldn't quite unlearn. It was something quieter than both of those. Something that felt like watching a person you used to know become more fully themselves than they ever had the chance to be when you knew them, and realizing that the person they became is someone you would choose now, deliberately, with full knowledge of both of you. She stopped writing and looked at him. What? Nothing, he said. You're staring. I'm sitting, he said. You're in the direction I'm facing. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the vicinity of one, and turned back to her letters. He stayed until she had finished and the lamp was low, and she made clear, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been managing her own situation for a long time, that she didn't need him to stay further. He walked back to the Silver Horn in the cold dark, and climbed the stairs to his room, and lay on his back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. But it was different from the sleeplessness of 4 days ago. That one had been the sleeplessness of a man drowning in something he didn't understand. This one was the sleeplessness of a man who understood exactly what was at stake and was prepared to stand there until it was over. That was, he had found in his experience, a considerably more useful place to be. Perch had the survey certifications ready by Wednesday morning, which was faster than Elias had expected, and which told him that Perch, in his careful, ink-stained way, understood exactly what was happening in this valley and had decided which side of it he wanted to be on. Clara received them without ceremony, checked every page with the focused attention of someone who has learned that the devil lives in administrative details, and added them to the growing stack of documentation that now occupied most of her desk and a significant portion of the floor space around it. The room was beginning to look less like a boarding house room and more like a field office for something that required systematic prosecution. Brecken wrote back, she said, without looking up from the certifications. He'll give a statement. He wants to do it in writing rather than in person, which is less useful but sufficient. She turned a page. Moss hasn't responded. I can ride out to Moss's property, Elias said. I'd rather go myself. She looked up. He's been reluctant because he doesn't trust intermediaries. He needs to hear from me directly what the situation is and what I'm asking of him. She set the certifications down. I'll go tomorrow morning. I'll come with you. She opened her mouth. Not to talk to Moss, he said. To ride with you. Those are different things. She closed her mouth and considered this with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether an argument was worth the energy it would cost. Fine, she said, but you stay with the horses. He stayed with the horses. It was a 40-minute ride to Moss's property on the western edge of the valley, through scrub and scattered pine that smelled of cold sap and recent rain. Moss himself turned out to be a gaunt, suspicious man in his 70s who came to his door with a shotgun that he didn't raise but didn't set aside, and who looked at Elias standing at the fence line with the horses, and then looked at Clara and said, "Who's that?" "A friend," Clara said. "He armed?" "Yes," she said. "So are you. Can I come in?" He let her in. Elias waited with the horses for 45 minutes, listening to the wind work through the pine branches and watching a pair of ravens dispute ownership of something on the far ridge. When Clara came back, she was walking with the straight-backed efficiency of someone who has accomplished what they came to accomplish and is already moving to the next thing. "He'll testify," she said, taking her horse's reins, in person. "What changed his mind?" She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. "I showed him the note Hale's man left on the boarding house door, and I told him that if he didn't add his voice to this, then when it was over, whichever way it went, he would have to live with having been the man who saw what was happening and said nothing." She gathered the reins. "He's got grandchildren in this valley. That's what it finally came down to." They rode back mostly in silence, which was a comfortable silence now. Not the silence of two people who don't know what to say to each other, but the silence of two people who are thinking about the same thing and don't need to narrate it. Elias noticed the difference and suspected Clara did too, though neither of them mentioned it. The hearing from Judge Hargrove's clerk arrived that afternoon. The expedited request had been approved. Hargrove would arrive in Redemption Ridge in 11 days, not 5 weeks. Clara read the letter twice. Then she sat down, which was unusual enough that Elias paid attention to it. She sat on the edge of her bed and held the letter in both hands and looked at it with an expression that he was learning to read. The expression that appeared when something significant happened and she was allowing herself briefly and privately to feel the weight of it before returning to practical mode. 11 days, she said. "Is that enough time?" "It has to be." She looked up. "Hale will know within a day. He has people in this town who tell him things." She set the letter on the desk. When he finds out Hargrove is coming early, he'll either accelerate what he's doing or he'll try something that changes the situation entirely. "What does changing the situation entirely look like?" She was quiet for a moment. "It looks like my documentation disappearing," she said, "or me not being present to present it." She said this plainly, without dramatizing it. "He's been careful so far. The threats have been calibrated, frightening but not leaving clear legal exposure. But men like Hale have a line beyond which careful stops mattering to them. I don't know where his line is." "I know where it is," Elias said. She looked at him. "It's wherever his back gets close enough to the wall," he said. "When he thinks he's about to lose the whole thing, the valley, the investment, the strategy he's spent years building, that's when careful goes out the window." He met her eyes. "We need to make copies of everything." She was already nodding. "I was thinking the same. Mrs. Weston's sister lives in the next town. I trust her. And Perch can hold copies in the county office. Anything stored officially is harder to make disappear." She stood. "I'll start tonight." "I'll help," he said. She looked at him. "You write like you're wearing gloves." "I write slowly," he said. "I'm accurate." She considered this. "Fine. Sit down." They spent 3 hours that evening making copies. Clara writing the substantive documents, Elias handling the simpler certifications and affidavit headers. And by the time the lamp was burning low and both their hands ached, there were 2 complete duplicate sets of everything Clara had assembled. One went into a locked box that Mrs. Weston agreed, with the grim cheerfulness of a woman who had decided to enjoy being part of something important, to transport to her sister personally the following morning. The other went to perch at the county office, hand-delivered by Elias before 8 the next day. Perch looked at the stack of documents, looked at Elias, and said, "Hale's lawyer filed an amendment to the surveying claim this morning." "What kind of amendment?" "The kind that introduces a competing survey conducted by a firm out of Dermont that conveniently produces different boundary measurements than the original county survey." Perch set his ink pen down. "The firm doesn't appear in any professional registry I can find. I've been looking for 2 hours." "A ghost survey," Elias said. "An extremely well-produced ghost survey," Perch said. "With a notary seal and everything?" He looked at the documents Elias had brought. "I'll store these officially. Counterfiling the original certified surveys against the amendment is going to be significant." He paused. "Judge Hargrove is going to have a busy first day in this town." Elias went back to Clara with the news about the amendment. She received it the way she received most bad news, with a brief, focused silence followed by an adjustment of position. "We expected something like this," she said. "Perch called it a ghost survey. The firm can't be found in any registry." "I know how to handle that," she said. She was pulling papers as she spoke. In the Creston Valley case, Hale's lawyer used the same method, a surveying firm that existed only on paper. The Creston County Records Office had a formal complaint filed against that firm by 3 neighboring landowners. If the same firm name appears on both, she found the page she was looking for. There. She held it up. He couldn't read it from across the room, but she could, and her expression confirmed what she was looking for. Same firm, different address, but the same name. She looked up, and for the first time since he'd known her in this chapter of their lives, he saw something on her face that was unmistakably satisfaction. Not gloating. She wasn't built for gloating, but the quiet, earned satisfaction of someone who laid a long trap and just heard it close. "Hale just made a mistake," she said. "A bad one?" "A very bad one." She set the paper down. "He used the same fraudulent survey firm across 2 territories. That's not a local dispute anymore. That's a pattern of fraud conducted across territorial lines, which elevates it beyond what a local judge handles." She looked at him. "Hargrove isn't just going to rule on my land claim. She's going to refer this to the territorial attorney." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know you have the Creston documentation." "He doesn't know I have most of what I have," she said. "He knows I'm a problem. He doesn't know the size of the problem." She began organizing the papers with quick, careful hands. "We need to get this in front of Hargrove the moment she arrives. Not the second day. The moment she gets off her horse." The next 6 days were the kind of days that feel longer than their hours because they contain too much waiting pressed against too much activity, with no reliable way to tell which moment will require which response. Elias settled into a rhythm of it. Mornings at the boarding house helping Clara organize and cross-reference. Afternoons moving through the town keeping a presence that he knew was as much about signal as about function. Hale's men were still visible in Redemption Ridge, still watching, still performing the casual surveillance that Edith Tatum had named correctly as the scariest part. 3 of the Valley ranchers came into town independently over those 6 days. Tatum and a woman named Louise Greer, who ran the property her husband had left her when he died 2 years back, and an older couple named the Hendersons who had been on their land for 30 years and who walked into Perch's office on a Thursday morning and said they wanted their statement recorded officially and in ink. Elias wasn't present for any of these individually, but Clara told him about each one, briefly, when he came by in the evenings. He noticed that she was sleeping less. The circles under her eyes deepened through the week, and she ate irregularly. He figured this out because Mrs. Weston mentioned it with a clucking exasperation that was the landlady's version of genuine worry. And her handwriting, which had started the week precise and even, was getting slightly smaller and more compressed by Friday, which he recognized as what happens when concentration intensifies beyond a certain point. He brought her food on Friday evening. He did not announce this as a thing he was doing. He simply appeared at her door with a covered plate from the saloon kitchen and set it on the corner of the desk that wasn't occupied by documentation. She looked at it, then at him. "Mrs. Weston said you haven't been eating much," he said. "Mrs. Weston talks too much," she said. "She's worried about you." "So are you." "Yes," he said without making anything of it. Eat. She ate. He sat in the corner chair and didn't talk, and she ate and kept reading documents in between bites. And it was deeply unglamorous, and also, he thought, one of the more honest moments they'd shared, which was something. When she finished, she pushed the plate aside and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You've changed." "I know. I mean specifically." She leaned back in her chair. "You used to fill silences. You were uncomfortable with them. You'd start talking about nothing in particular just to have something going." She looked at him with the evaluating quality he was used to now. "You don't do that anymore." "I ran out of things to say that weren't important," he said. "When?" "About 15 years ago," he said. "Give or take." She looked at him steadily. "Are you all right?" The question surprised him, not because it was unexpected in theory, but because of when she asked it, not at a dramatic moment, not as part of a larger conversation, just directly, in the practical tone she used for things that actually mattered to her. "Most days," he said. "Not every day." "That's honest." "I'm trying to be." She nodded. She looked like she was going to say something else, and then decided to let it sit, which he appreciated. There are things that don't need to be said to be understood, and both of them had lived long enough to know the difference. On Saturday, Hale made his move. It didn't come the way Elias had been watching for. He'd been watching for a confrontation, men with guns, something direct and violent that he could respond to with the set of skills he actually possessed. What came instead was a legal document delivered to Perch's office at 7 in the morning before Perch arrived, slid under the door by someone who didn't stay to be identified. Perch brought it to Clara. Clara read it at her desk with Elias standing behind her and Mrs. Weston in the doorway, and when she finished, she set it down very carefully, like it was something that required handling. "He's filed for an emergency injunction," she said. "He's asking a judge, not Hargrove, a different judge out of the Southern Circuit, to freeze all property transactions in the disputed parcel pending resolution of the survey conflict." She looked up. "If it's granted before Hargrove arrives, she can't act on the evidence. The case goes into procedural suspension, potentially for months." "Can he do that?" Mrs. Weston asked. "He's doing it," Claire said. She was very still, which Elias had come to recognize as the sign that she was at her most focused rather than her least. The Southern Circuit judge has a different relationship with Hale's legal team than Hargrove does. "If we don't respond before that injunction gets signed—" "How long?" Elias asked. "The filing requires 48 hours before it can be acted on," she said. "Hargrove arrives in 4 days." She looked at the document again. "We need to get a counterfiling to the Southern Circuit judge before he signs it, and we need to notify Hargrove's clerk that there's an attempt to preempt her jurisdiction." "I can ride to the Southern Circuit today," Elias said. "How far?" 6 hours there, 6 back. You'd arrive after the court office closes." She was thinking as she spoke. "But Calloway used to be a deputy in that district. He knows the judge's clerk personally." She looked at Elias. "Can you take him with you? With my counterfiling and a letter from Perch about the fraudulent survey firm, if Calloway can get the clerk to hold the injunction pending Hargrove's arrival." "Tell me what to bring," Elias said. She had the counterfiling and Perch's letter prepared in 90 minutes. Perch, who had arrived at his office to find Clara already there and had been fully briefed in the time it took him to hang up his coat, signed the letter with an expression of a man who has decided that 11 years of careful neutrality is enough, and it's time to put his name on something. Elias and Calloway rode out before 10. The ride was hard, cold, and long, and Elias's shoulder announced its displeasure somewhere around the 3rd hour, in a way that he ignored because there was no useful response to it. Calloway rode well and talked little, which made him good company for the purpose. They arrived at the Southern Circuit town with 30 minutes to spare before the court office closed for the day. Calloway knew the clerk. The clerk was a meticulous young woman who listened to the situation with focused attention and who, when Calloway finished explaining and Elias placed the counterfiling and Perch's letter on her desk, looked at the documents for a long moment and said, "The judge hasn't signed it yet. He was going to review it Monday morning." "Can you flag it as contested?" Calloway asked. I can flag it as subject to jurisdictional conflict and route it for review alongside the counterfiling, she said carefully. That's procedurally appropriate given the timing of the Hargrove Circuit hearing. That's all we're asking, Calloway said. She flagged it. She stamped the counterfiling with a received date. She did all of this with the careful deliberation of someone who understands that procedural correctness is its own form of protection. Elias and Calloway rode back through the dark. It was a cold night, clear, with stars that had nothing sympathetic to say about 6 hours in the saddle after 6 hours in the saddle. Elias's shoulder was no longer announcing itself. It had progressed to a sustained statement that he was going to be paying for this for several days. He got back to Redemption Ridge at close to midnight. There was a lamp still burning in Claire's window. He knocked softly. She opened the door. She had clearly not slept. He told her what happened. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her in practical mode, and when he finished, she let out a long breath and sat down on the edge of the bed. It works, she said. If the clerk does what she said, Hargrove arrives before anyone can act on the injunction. I think it works, Elias said. I'm not going to tell you it's certain. Nothing is certain, she said. But it's better than it was this morning. She looked up at him. He was still standing because he'd been standing for most of the last 14 hours, and sitting down felt like a commitment his body might not let him take back. She noticed. Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over. He sat down on the chair. She got up and poured water from the pitcher on the washstand and handed it to him, and he drank it in a way that was not dignified but was necessary. Your shoulder, she said, watching him. It's fine. You're holding it the way you hold it when it's not fine. Old injury, he said. It objects to long rides. I know what it is, she said, matter of fact. You were shot in that shoulder. She said this like it was a fact from a file she'd been keeping, which in some sense he supposed she had. I can do something about the inflammation if you'll let me. He opened his mouth. I'm a healer, she said. I've done this for 20 years. Don't make it strange. He did not make it strange. She got her medical bag from under the bed and he took his jacket off and she worked on his shoulder with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who genuinely did this for a living and was not performing comfort, just providing it. Her hands were strong and precise, and she didn't ask him if it hurt when it hurt, just worked through it. After a while, she said, without looking up from what she was doing, I'm going to be honest with you. Go ahead. I'm afraid, she said. She said it plainly, in the same tone she used for everything important. Not of Hale specifically, of this whole thing going wrong, of having built all of this and having it come apart in the last few days because of something I didn't account for. She paused in what she was doing. I've had things I built come apart before. I know what that feels like. I'm afraid of feeling it again. He looked at the wall rather than at her because looking at her in this particular moment felt like it would take something from her that she hadn't offered. I know, he said. I'm not telling you to fix it, she said. She started working again. I'm just telling you. I know, he said again. I'm glad you told me. She finished and he put his jacket back on and his shoulder felt measurably better, though he wasn't going to tell her that immediately because it would seem too conclusive. It helps, he said. I know it helps, she said without vanity. I've been doing this for 20 years. She went to her desk. He stood to leave. Elias, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. For today. For all of it. She was looking at the papers on her desk, not at him. I know what you gave up when you walked out of that hotel room with Hale. You gave up a lot of money and a clear path out of this situation. You could have said yes and gone somewhere quiet and nobody would have blamed you. I would have, he said. I know, she said softly. That's why I'm thanking you. He left her there at her desk with her lamp and her papers, doing what she did, which was build careful things out of careful work, and he walked back to the Silverhorn through a town that was dark and cold and quiet. Somewhere out there, Victor Hale was doing his own calculations. Elias could almost feel it. The specific quality of a man realizing that the situation he thought he controlled had more resistance in it than he'd planned for. Men like Hale didn't fold when they hit resistance. They pushed harder. And the push, when it came, was not going to be a document slid under a door. 3 days. Hargrove would be here in 3 days. Elias climbed the stairs to his room and took his jacket off slowly and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in a very long time he understood precisely what he was living for, which was a thing that made the ceiling considerably easier to look at. Hargrove arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week that Clara had first spoken Elias's name in the Silverhorn Saloon, and he noticed that without attaching any particular meaning to it, because he was not a man who dealt in omens. He dealt in what was in front of him, and what was in front of him that morning was a circuit judge climbing down from a covered wagon with the unhurried authority of someone who has been doing difficult work for a long time and has stopped needing to announce it. Judge Hargrove was somewhere in her late 50s, compact and straight-backed, with iron-gray hair pinned severely and a face that suggested she had heard every possible argument at least twice and had developed efficient methods for sorting the ones that mattered from the ones that didn't. She carried her own documents rather than handing them to the young clerk who traveled with her, and she walked through Redemption Ridge's main street with the assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. Elias watched from across the street. Clara was beside him, and she was watching Hargrove with an expression he recognized, the same expression she'd had when she found the matching survey firm name in her Creston documents. Focused. Certain without being reckless about it. "She's earlier than scheduled," Clara said, "by about 4 hours. Is that good or bad?" "It means she read the clerk's briefing about the jurisdictional conflict and decided she wanted to see the situation directly rather than through paperwork." Clara looked at him. "That's good. That's someone who makes decisions based on evidence rather than convenience." They had arranged, through Hargrove's clerk, to present Clara's documentation that afternoon. The hearing itself was scheduled for the following morning, but Clara had requested a pre-hearing meeting to submit her evidence, and the clerk had confirmed it. What Clara had not counted on, and what complicated the afternoon considerably, was that Victor Hale had scheduled his own pre-hearing meeting for the same day at 1 o'clock, an hour before Clara's, and that he arrived at the Ridge Hotel, where Hargrove had taken rooms, with his lawyer Aldrich and 2 associates, and the specific confidence of a man who believes the first version of events into a room has an advantage. Clara found this out from Perch, who found it out from the hotel proprietor, who told Perch because the hotel proprietor had the social instincts of a town crier and the discretion of a weather vane. "He's going to try to frame the entire matter as a fraudulent acquisition on my part," Clara said. They were in Perch's office, which had become something of an unofficial headquarters over the past 10 days. "He'll present the ghost survey first, establish the jurisdictional dispute on his terms, and try to have the counterfiling characterized as a delay tactic." "Can you go in earlier?" Elias asked. "I'm not going to do that," Clara said. "I'm not going to chase him. I'm going to walk in at 2 o'clock with everything I have and let the evidence speak in the order it belongs." She looked at Perch. "Will you come with me?" Perch looked slightly surprised, then resolved. "Yes," he said. "Official county record capacity. Yes." "And Calloway," she said, "and Tatum and Louise Greer. I want the ranchers there. I want Hargrove to see that this isn't one woman with a land grievance. I want her to see a valley." Those 2 hours between 1 o'clock and 2 were among the more uncomfortable of Elias's recent life, which was saying something given the general quality of the last several weeks. He stood outside the Ridge Hotel in the cold and watched Hale's lawyer go in and come back out and confer with one of the associates and go back in, and he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his shoulders still aching from the long ride, and he did the thing Clara had asked him to do, which was nothing. Nothing was hard. Nothing was, in his experience, considerably harder than something, because something had direction and purpose, and something gave his hands a reason to be where they were. Nothing was just standing in the cold, being aware of everything he couldn't control. At 10 minutes to 2, Clara came down the main street with Perch on one side and Calloway on the other, and Tatum and Louise Greer behind them, and to Elias's genuine surprise, the Hendersons walking with the steady gait of people who have made a decision and intend to see it through. 7 people in total, walking together without theater, just walking the same direction at the same speed for the same purpose. He fell in beside her without discussion. She didn't tell him to stay outside. Hargrove received them in the hotel's private meeting room, the same room where Hale had met with Elias 3 weeks earlier. The furniture had been rearranged. The table was longer now, with chairs on both sides, and Hargrove sat at the head of it with her clerk beside her and a leather document case open on the table. She looked at the group that filed into the room with the same taking inventory expression she'd had on the street that morning. Aldrich, Hale's lawyer, was already in the room. He looked at Clara's group with a controlled expression that Elias read as a man recalculating while maintaining the appearance of not recalculating. Hale himself was not present. Elias noticed this and thought about it. "Mrs. Whitmore," Hargrove said, "sit down, please. All of you, find a seat." Clara sat directly across from Hargrove and set her documentation on the table, so the organized, cross-referenced, 8-month-built stack of it, and Hargrove looked at the size of it with an expression that was not quite a raised eyebrow, but was in that direction. "You've been thorough," Hargrove said. "I've had time," Clara said. What followed was 2 hours that Elias spent mostly as a wall. Clara presented her case with the methodical clarity of someone who has organized the same material so many times that the sequence is entirely automatic, which freed her to watch Hargrove's responses rather than her own papers. Perch certified the county records. Tatum spoke about the water pressure and the fence line challenges. Louise Greer described the men who had stood at her fence line and watched, and she described it with a flatness that was more effective than outrage would have been. The Hendersons spoke briefly and precisely about a conversation in which one of Hale's men had described, in specific terms, what would happen to their livestock if they didn't cooperate with a proposed land sale. Through all of it, Aldrich objected with the frequency of a man who is performing objection rather than believing in it, and Hargrove noted each one and sustained none. The moment that shifted the room came when Clara placed the matching survey firm documentation on the table. She walked Hargrove through it quietly. "Here's the Creston Valley case. Here's the firm name. Here's the same firm name appearing on the ghost survey filed in this jurisdiction 3 weeks ago. Here is the formal complaint filed against this firm in Creston. Here is evidence that the firm's registered address in Dermont does not correspond to any existing building." Hargrove was quiet for a long time after that. Aldrich said, "Your Honor, the survey in question was commissioned in good faith by my client and—" "Mr. Aldrich," Hargrove said without looking at him, "I'll let you know when I'm ready for your response." Aldrich stopped talking. Hargrove looked at the documentation for another long minute. Then she looked at Clara. "You assembled this over 8 months?" "Yes." "While also managing the property acquisition, maintaining a medical practice, and assisting other ranchers in the valley with their dispute documentation?" "Yes," Clara said. Hargrove looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally something else. "All right," she said. "I'll review everything tonight. Formal hearing is 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." She looked at Aldrich. "Tell your client to be present." They filed out. In the hotel corridor, Louise Greer let out a long breath that had apparently been held for the last 2 hours. Tatum shook Clara's hand. Perch gathered his documents with the expression of a man who is trying not to appear as satisfied as he is. Elias waited until they were outside. The afternoon had gone gray and a wind was working its way down from the ridge. Clara walked beside him without speaking for half a block, and then he said, "How did that go?" "I don't know yet," she said. "She's fair." "I could see her following the evidence." She paused. "Aldrich knows the survey firm documentation is the problem. He'll spend tonight trying to build a response to it." "Can he?" "He can try," she said. "It's going to be difficult to explain why the same fictional firm appears in 2 separate territories 3 years apart." She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "But courts are unpredictable. I've seen cases with worse evidence go wrong because of procedure or politics or just bad luck." She looked at him. "I'm not going to tell you I'm certain." "You never do," he said. She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "It's one of the things I trust most about you." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked ahead. They walked. That evening, Elias was at the Silverhorn when Decker came in. Not with an invitation this time. Decker sat down at Elias's table without being asked, the same way he had the first time. But the practiced stillness was different tonight. There was something tighter in it. "Mr. Hale would like to make a revised offer," Decker said. "Same answer as the first one," Elias said. "He's offering considerably more." "I heard you," Elias said. Same answer. Decker looked at him for a moment. He's also asking whether Mrs. Whitmore would accept a cash settlement on the property. Market rate plus 30%. She's not interested in selling the property, Elias said. That's the problem, Decker said. And for the first time, his controlled neutrality slipped enough to reveal something underneath it that wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Mr. Hale doesn't have a lot of options left after tomorrow. I know, Elias said. Men without options do things that are harder to predict, Decker said. It wasn't a threat. It was something closer to a warning, which was a different thing, and Elias adjusted his reading of Decker accordingly. Are you speaking for him or for yourself? Elias said. Decker was quiet for a moment. I've been in his employ for 4 years, he said carefully. I've done work in that time that I had reasons for. Some of those reasons were good, some were less good. He looked at the table. The note on the boarding house door, that wasn't my work. Who did it? A man named Farr. He doesn't work for Hale directly. He gets hired through a third party when the work is the kind that benefits from distance. Decker met his eyes. I'm telling you that because Farr is still in this town, and because I don't know what he's been asked to do before tomorrow morning. Elias set his glass down slowly. Where's he staying? I don't know, Decker said. Genuinely. I was told tonight that he was still here. I wasn't told where. He pushed back from the table. That's everything I have. He left. Elias sat for 30 seconds, running through the geometry of it, and then he was on his feet. He went to Clara first. She needed to know, and she needed to not be alone, and those were the two facts that organized everything else. He told her about Decker, about Farr, about the revised offer that was really a measurement of how cornered Hale felt. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, The documents are with Perch and with Mrs. Weston's sister. Even if something happens to what's in this room, I'm not worried about the documents, he said. I'm worried about you. She looked at him. She started to say something about not needing. He could see it forming. And then she stopped, and something in her face shifted into honesty. All right, she said. What do you want to do? You stay here tonight. Lock the door, keep the rifle where it is. I'm going to walk this town until morning and find out where Farr is. You can't walk all night. I've done it before, he said. Many times. She looked at him for a long moment. Elias, if you find him, I'm going to find him before he does whatever he's been asked to do, Elias said. That's all. That's not all. And you know it. Clara. He met her eyes. I'm going to handle it the way you'd want me to handle it, not the way I used to handle things. You have my word on that. She held his gaze. She was searching for something in his face, and he let her search. All right, she said finally. Go. He found Farr at 2 a.m, not through any great detective work. He found him because Farr found him, or tried to. Elias was coming back along the alley behind the boarding house on his third pass of the block when he heard the specific sound of a boot on gravel that was trying not to be heard, and he stepped into a doorway and waited, and Farr came past him in the dark, moving toward the back door of the Weston boarding house, with a purpose that did not require interpretation. Elias stepped out. Hey, he said. Farr was fast, faster than Elias had expected. A quick pivot, hand going for his gun, and he nearly got there. Nearly. Elias had his own gun out before Farr's clears leather, and the distance between them was about 4 feet, and neither of them moved for a full 3 seconds. Put it away, Elias said. Farr's hand didn't move. I'm not going to shoot you, Elias said. But if you clear that gun, I will, and I'd rather not. Put it away. Something shifted in Farr's calculation. He withdrew his hand slowly. Walk away from this town, Elias said. Tonight. Whatever Hale is paying you, it's not worth what happens if you go through that door. And if I don't? Then I take you to the sheriff, and you explain what you were doing behind a boarding house at 2 a.m. with your hand on your gun. Elias kept his own gun steady. And I give Calloway and the sheriff the note you left on the door 3 weeks ago, which Mrs. Weston and 4 residents can testify they saw delivered. He watched Farr's face. You're a hired man, not a principal. The law takes that into account, but only if you're smart enough to let it. Farr looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the boarding house door. Then he looked back at Elias. He walked away. Elias stood in the alley until the sound of Farr's boots was gone, and then went further until there was no question of it. And then he went back and knocked softly on Clara's window from the outside. 2 knocks, which they'd agreed on, and saw the lamplight come on inside, and after a moment the curtain move. He went back to the Silver Horn and sat in the dark downstairs and did not sleep, because sleep wasn't available, but the sleeplessness was different from all the previous versions. It was the sleeplessness of a man who is waiting for morning, because morning contains something he is looking forward to. Judge Hargrove's hearing began at 9 o'clock in the jailhouse, which was the largest available space in Redemption Ridge, with room for the public. And the public arrived in numbers that surprised Elias, and apparently did not surprise Clara. The benches were full. People were standing at the back. Mrs. Weston was in the 3rd row. The Hendersons were in the 2nd. Louise Greer was in the 1st row, and had apparently arrived early enough to choose her seat deliberately. Hale was present, as instructed. He sat with Aldrich and his 2 associates at one table, and his face had the controlled quality of a man who has been up all night finding responses to problems he didn't expect to have. He did not look at Clara. She did not look at him. Hargrove came in without ceremony and sat down and looked at the room with the inventory expression, and then looked at the parties and said, "Let's begin." What followed was 3 hours that Elias will never be able to describe in precise detail because he was paying attention to the wrong things, not the legal arguments, which he followed imperfectly, but Clara's posture, Hargrove's face, and the moment, about 90 minutes in, when Aldrich began his response to the cross-territorial survey firm evidence, and the room understood from the quality of his argument that he didn't have one. He spoke for 20 minutes and said nothing that touched the central problem, which was that a firm that didn't exist had produced official documents in 2 different territories, and that the man who had commissioned both sets of documents was sitting at the next table with a controlled face and nowhere to put his hands. Hale tried. Elias gave him that. He tried the way men try when they're trained to believe the problem is always the other person's preparation rather than their own conduct. He questioned Clara's methodology, the legitimacy of rancher testimony, the chain of custody of the Creston documents. Hargrove allowed every question and noted every answer, and by the time the lunch recess came, the shape of the proceeding was clear to everyone in the room, including, Elias thought, Hale himself. Hargrove delivered her ruling at 2 in the afternoon. She dismissed the fraudulent surveying claim against Clara's property entirely, citing the demonstrated pattern of fraud across territorial lines. She confirmed Clara's purchase arrangement as legitimate and ordered the county to complete the property transfer within 30 days. She referred the broader matter, the 12 Valley acquisitions, the water manipulation, the intimidation pattern, to the territorial attorney's office for formal investigation. She also said something that Elias didn't expect and that he would remember afterward. She looked up from her notes at the end and addressed the room rather than the parties, which was unusual, and she said, "I've reviewed a significant amount of documentation in this case, some of which represents years of careful, methodical work by private individuals protecting their community's interests, without the benefit of legal training or institutional support. The quality of that work is not something I take for granted. Courts depend on evidence. Evidence depends on someone being willing to gather it." She didn't look at Clara specifically. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room did. Hale left Redemption Ridge 4 days later. He left without theater, a wagon, 2 associates, a silence that was its own kind of statement. Aldrich had already gone. The legal challenges dissolved without Hale's presence to drive them, like structures that turned out to have been held up by his confidence rather than their own weight. The valley adjusted. It adjusted slowly and imperfectly, the way real things adjust, not all at once and not without friction. The Farleys came to Clara a week after the hearing, Martin Farley sitting across from her at her desk with the specific discomfort of a man who's trying to say something that doesn't have a clean form, and Clara listened to him without filling his silences. And afterwards she told Elias that Martin Farley was going to be all right. Not today. Eventually. Perch filed the final property transfer documents on a Wednesday morning, which was, again, a Wednesday. Elias was there when Clara signed them. She signed her name in her precise, slightly compressed handwriting and then put the pen down and looked at the completed document and was quiet for a moment. Perch slid the certified copy across the desk to her, and she picked it up. "Congratulations," Perch said. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You did most of it," he said. "You did the parts that required someone people already trusted," she said. "That's not nothing." He accepted this with the dignified nod of a man who has been waiting 11 years for someone to say that. Outside, the November air was the cold that means it, and Elias fell into step beside her as she walked back toward the boarding house. The property was officially hers now, 62 acres along Copper Creek, which was not a large holding by some standards, but which was, by Clara's standards and by the standards of what it had cost to get there, considerable. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "Build a proper house first," she said. "The structure that's there isn't much. Then a kitchen garden. Then I'll see." She looked straight ahead. "I've been making plans in increments for a long time. I'm not used to planning further than the next obstacle." "The obstacles seem to have cleared some," he said. "Temporarily," she said, and she said it without bitterness, just accuracy. "There are always more. But these particular ones—" She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She was looking down the main street of Redemption Ridge, which was its ordinary self in November, functional, unglamorous, full of people going about the ordinary business of surviving a place that required consistent effort. "These particular ones were worth it," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him, and he looked back, and they stood there on the boardwalk in the November cold in the plainest possible configuration of two people who have found each other on the far side of everything that tried to separate them, and there was nothing cinematic about it. Her nose was red from the cold. His shoulders still ached. Neither of them had slept enough in the past 3 weeks. "I'm going to say something," she said, "and I need you to not make it into more than it is." "All right." "I'm glad you came to this town," she said. "I don't know what it means going forward. I don't know what we are or what we're going to be. I'm not ready to know that yet." She held his gaze steadily. "But I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you stayed, and I'm glad you turned down Hale's money." She paused. "And I'm glad you stopped the way you did when you heard my voice, because I wasn't sure you would." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't have a choice about that one," he said. "Some things you can't not stop for." She looked at him, then she looked away, down the street. "Don't rush me," she said again. "I won't," he said. "I've got time." She started walking again. He walked beside her. Somewhere in the month that followed, he started helping with the property without it being formally arranged, showing up on weekends with tools, fixing the structural problems in the existing building with the competence of a man who had learned enough about building things in his 54 years to be useful even without formal training, though he made mistakes and corrected them and made different ones, which Clara observed without comment except when the mistake was structural, at which point she commented directly and specifically, and he fixed it. He was not living on the property. That was not where they were. He was still in his room at the Silverhorn, still doing the occasional job that his reputation made available, though he had started being selective about what he took in a way he hadn't been in years. He turned down 2 requests that involved using intimidation as a tool. He took a job tracking a stolen horse that turned out to be a horse that had simply wandered, which was unsatisfying but harmed no one. What he found, in those ordinary weeks, was the thing he hadn't expected to find. Not happiness exactly, which seemed too large a word for what a person can reliably locate in their daily life, but something more durable than happiness. Satisfaction, maybe. The particular quality of a day that contains purpose and ends with something having been built, or maintained, or kept. He thought sometimes about the 25 years. He thought about the man he'd been in them, the work he'd done, the places he'd gone looking for something he couldn't name and hadn't found. He didn't think it had been wasted, exactly. He thought it had been what it had been, a long, difficult passage through a life that had taken a wrong turn early and taken considerable time to find its way back. Clara, he knew, carried her version of the same accounting. She didn't talk about it much, and he didn't push her to. But sometimes in the evenings when they were both at her desk, her working on the property management records she kept with the same precision she'd brought to the legal case, him with something simple and less demanding, She would stop for a moment and be somewhere else briefly and then come back. He never asked where she went. He thought he knew, and he thought it was a place she had the right to visit without explanation. One evening in December, with the first proper snow coming down past the window and a fire going in the small stove she'd had installed, she put her pen down and looked at him. "Do you remember what you said to me the first time?" she asked. "Which time?" "The first time, at my father's property, when I told you you were trespassing." He thought about it. "I said I'd pay for the water." "You said half a day's work," she said, "and then you stayed and fixed 3 things I hadn't mentioned." She looked at him steadily. "You've always done that, fixed more than you were asked to. I used to find it annoying. You have an inability to leave something broken if you can see it." "Is that a problem?" he said. "No," she said. She looked at the fire. "It's just a thing I know about you, one of the things I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm learning the new ones." "I'm learning yours too," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been patient about it." "You told me not to rush you." "I did." She looked at him. "I'm still not ready for everything," she said plainly, "but I'm less not ready than I was." He nodded. "That's enough," he said. "It's not enough," she corrected, and she said it with something in her voice that was different from the careful steadiness of the past weeks. Warmer, slightly unguarded. The voice of someone who has decided to stop defending a position. "It's just where I am." She looked at him. "I'm telling you because you should know where I am." "Then I know," he said. She nodded. She picked up her pen. After a moment, she put it back down and looked at the snow outside the window. "There is a thing that happens to people who survive long enough through hard enough circumstances, and it is this. They stop believing that good things are permanent and start being surprised when good things last even briefly. They become careful with good things the way you're careful with something fragile, holding it gently, not gripping too tight, always half prepared for the moment it breaks. This is not ingratitude. This is what extended difficulty teaches. It teaches you the real weight of things." What Elias understood, sitting in that small warm room in December with the snow coming down and Clara's lamp burning steadily and 54 years of living behind him, was that this, whatever this was, this incomplete and unhurried and imperfectly assembled thing, was the real weight of something. Not the legend, not the reputation, not the 25 years of moving from one place to the next with a gun and a skill set and no particular reason to stop moving. This, a room, a desk, a woman with silver hair who had survived everything the world threw at her and was still, at 58, choosing to build rather than stop, who had told him not to rush her and who he had promised not to, and who was now, in the quiet evidence of daily presence and patient work, slowly, on her own terms, letting him in. Outside, the snow-covered Redemption Ridge without judgment or preference, settling equally on the Ridge Hotel and the jailhouse and the boarding house and the 62 acres along Copper Creek where, in the spring, Clara Whitmore intended to break ground on something that would last. He hadn't done many things in his life that he was proud of. He was proud of this. Not of winning anything, not of being the fastest or the most feared or the man who walked out of the most dangerous rooms still breathing. Proud of sitting still, proud of listening, proud of having had, at 54 years old, enough sense left in him to walk into a saloon in a small valley town and hear a voice and stop. Some things you can't not stop for. He had stopped. And then, for the first time in 25 years, he had stayed. That, in the end, was the whole of it. Not a legend. Just a man who finally stopped running from the only life that had ever made any sense to him, and a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing and was willing, slowly, to let that life include him. The snow kept falling. The lamp kept burning. Neither of them needed to say anything else.